Forget the Sambadrome for a moment, and forget the floodlights, the wall of drums, and forget about the float as tall as a house. We're going to begin somewhere much smaller. There is a patch of packed earth, somewhere in the interior of Bahia, in the northeast of Brazil. It's late at night, people are standing in a loose ring. Hand claps come first, just hands, keeping time. Then a voice, one voice, throwing out the line, and the ring throws it back. A single dancer steps into the middle, feet moving fast and low, almost flat to the ground, while everyone else holds the circle and waits their turn. Notice what is missing, because there is no stage, no front. Everyone is facing an audience, because everybody is the audience, and everybody is the show. The music has no conductor, it just runs itself. This is a roda, Portuguese for circle, a wheel. And some version of this circle is about as close as we can get to the source of everything this podcast is about. Long before the Samba schools, long before Rio was the center of any of all this. But here is the hard part, and I'm not going to walk around it. The people who made this circle were overwhelmingly enslaved Africans and their descendants. This beauty grew up inside of one of the largest systems of human bondage that history has ever seen. And that puts a question on the table that this whole episode has to answer honestly. How does something this full of joy come out of something this brutal, without or turning the joy into proof that the brutality was not that bad after all, and without turning the people into nothing but their suffering? Well, that is the needle we are going to try and thread today. I am Maicão, and this is Samba Stories. It is a show about Samba Enredo and the Carnival of Rio de Janeiro for those who love the spectacle but were never told what sits underneath it. And before I go a step further, the thing I say at the start of every episode. Everything I say in this episode is based on my current understanding and knowledge. That understanding may change as I learn more. Being human means I may miss an essential piece of information, or even that I draw a connection that turns out to be wrong. This podcast is an ongoing effort, my effort to learn and understand, not the final word. I lean on that disclaimer even harder in this episode than in almost any other, because this one is not about a rulebook or patterns. It's about slavery, about religion, about the origins of an art form, and I'm someone from the outside who was invited in. So here's the deal I am making with you for the next 20 or so minutes. I'm going to keep 4 different things apart, out loud, the whole way through. There is what is documented, a law, a date, or a record. There is what people at the time said and believed. There is what scholars argue over now, often agreeing or disagreeing with one another. And there is what I think, my own reading. Those are 4 different kinds of claim, and when I blur them together, I do both you a disservice and insult history. So I'll keep telling you which one I'm handing. And I'm going to describe the past on its own terms first, before I ever hold it up against ours. The people in this story could not see the future. I'm not going to pretend that they could. The other thing I do on this show is treat Carnival as a machine. Take the panel off, look at how it truly runs, see who is running it. Episode 2 is the same job, only aimed backwards. We are going to reverse engineer an origin. What were the raw inputs? What were the conditions? And how did they combine into something that, centuries later, can stop traffic on an avenue in Rio? So let us start with the inputs. And the first one is the hardest thing I will say all episode. Here is the uncomfortable truth at the bottom of where Samba comes from. The single largest input was forced human migration. Not the migration anyone chose, it was a trade in people. And we can put real numbers on it, thanks to a remarkable piece of work called the Slave Voyages Database. Historians who reconstructed the trade from the records of roughly 36,000 individual slaving voyages. Here is what they estimate. Across about 3.5 centuries, somewhere near 12.5 million Africans were forced onto ships bound for the Americas. Around 10.7 million survived the crossing. The gap between those two figures, more than 1.5 million human beings? Well, that is the number of people who died on the way, in the hold, at sea. That gap has a name. It's called the Middle Passage. And if everyone carried a life to the Americas, one country took the largest share, by a monstrous margin: Brazil. The best estimates land somewhere around 4.8 to 5 million disembarked in Brazil, close to half of the entire transatlantic trade, and more than 10 times the number taken to what is now the United States of America. And I want to be honest that these are reconstructions rather than a headcount. They get refined as historians turn up more records. However, the shape of this is not in dispute. Brazil was the single biggest destination of the whole transatlantic slave trade, and it is not even close. Here's the thing: those people did not arrive as blank material, a blank slate. Every one of them carried something the trade could not confiscate: language, song, dance, rhythm, belief systems, whole ways of holding a community together. They came from many different parts of West and Central Africa, different nations, different tongues, thrown together by force in a strange and hostile place. Samba is, in part, what happened when all of that knowledge had to survive in the same cramped and dangerous and improvised conditions. And so, it began combining into something entirely new. I would like to stop being a narrator for a moment and tell you why that one idea, strangers forced together, and something new growing out of it, is not really that abstract for me. About 7 years ago, I was traveling in the Middle East. It was a tourist trip. However, I have a habit of wandering off the marked path, and one afternoon that habit dropped me into a conversation with a group of men working there. Men who had come from Pakistan and from India to earn a living. And as we spoke, the thing they told me, plainly, as though it were just the weather, was that their passports had been taken from them upon arrival by the company they worked for. Held, no date given for their return. And I will let them have the word the way they used it. They described a kind of bondage. Not the same thing we have been talking about. I'm not flattening 3 centuries into one afternoon. But a real, present-day version of having your freedom held in someone else's hand. And here is what caught me. These men, who had so little, pulled me into the room they were living in. Crammed does not even begin to cover it. But they insisted on sharing a meal, a traditional one, which they made for a stranger. I tried to give them something back, some money, anything, but they would not hear of it. Not for even a moment. I ended up walking back to my hotel that night, turning it over, because I had never stood that close to anything like it, and I have never since. But the part that stayed with me was something one of them said. These were 2 nationalities with a long and hard history between them, real animosity, war, and generations of it. And he told me that working side by side, stuck in the same bad situation, was the thing that finally dissolved it for them. The shared weight did what nothing else had been able to. I cannot not hear the echo. The people who built the circle we opened this episode in came from many different nations and tribes. Some of them rivals, some of them enemies before the ships ever came. Forced into the same hold, the same plantations, the same absolutely impossible conditions. And out of that, somehow, came shared songs, a shared beat, a shared way of staying alive. I will never tell you it was the same. However, the shape of it, the vision dissolving under shared weight, and something new built in its place. I have now seen a corner of that with my own eyes. So when I say Samba was built by people thrown together across deep divides, I'm not reaching for a metaphor. I'm telling you about something I have watched unfold, just centuries removed and on the other side of the world from where it happened in our story. And it leaves me with a question which I cannot fully answer, and I will not pretend to. We look back at this strait through our own eyes, with our own categories. The people living it did not have our map. What the record shows is them identifying by nation, by language, by where they came from, not by one shared identity stretched across an entire continent. That idea came later, and a good deal of it came from the outside. So did they make sense of what was happening to them the way we were narrated now? Honestly, we do not get to know the inside of this. The documents are loud about what was done to people. However, they go quiet on how those people, in their own minds, or in their own heads, made sense of it. And I would rather sit in that silence honestly than fill it with a story we cannot back up. Right, back to the record. Now, the legal reality, stated plainly, because the rule on this show is that we describe a period as it was before we judge it. For most of Brazil's history, slavery was legal. It was economically central. It built the sugar fortunes, the tobacco fortunes, the ports themselves, and it was socially normalized by the institutions and by much of the population of the time. I need you to hear exactly what that sentence is and what it is not. Normal at the time is a description of an institution's legal and social status. It is not me saying that everyone accepted this, and it is most certainly not me saying it was right. Enslaved people resisted, they escaped, they bought their own freedom when they could, built free black communities, pushed back through religion, through the courts, through open revolt. The normalization is a fact about the system. It was never unanimous, and it was never just. Slavery in Brazil was finally abolished by law on the 13th of May 1888. A short degree people call the Lei Áurea, the Golden Law. It declared slavery extinct in Brazil from that date on. And then it stopped. That law freed people. It did not give them land. It did not give them housing or money or work or any repair for what had been taken. Brazil was the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery, and when it finally did, it set people free into a country that had built no place for them to land. Hold on to that, it is going to explain a great deal about where Samba goes next, and about why it still has to fight to exist long after the chains were legally gone. So where does our circle actually come from? To answer that, I have to take you to one specific corner of Brazil, and I have to fix a picture in your head before we go. When I tell you this art form has deep roots in the Recôncavo of Bahia, do not picture an isolated rural backwater. Wrong picture, you can delete it. The Recôncavo is the ring of land that wraps around the Bay of All Saints, a great bay on Brazil's northeastern coast. The word itself points at that shape, the land curving around the water. At the mouth of the bay sits Salvador, which was the capital of colonial Brazil for more than 200 years, and one of the most important ports in the whole Atlantic world. Around the bay, towns such as Santo Amaro and Cachoeira, sugar plantations, tobacco fields, rivers and boats moving goods and people constantly between the plantations and the towns and the port. So think of it less as a sleepy village and more as a network, a grid of plantations, markets, churches, docks, and waterways, with people moving through the nodes at all time. Enslaved and free, African-born and Brazilian-born. And anywhere you have a dense network like that, you have something precious for a culture fighting to survive. Contact, people meeting, knowledge crossing between them, songs and steps and words and beliefs from a dozen different African origins, plus the Portuguese language pressing in from above, and additionally, an indigenous presence already there. All rubbing against each other, year after year and generation after generation. And the numbers that moved through there are staggering on their own. Bahia, this one region with Salvador as its port, took in well over 1 million Africans across the full span of the trade. I will not give you a single hard figure, because the estimates do not fully agree. Some land between 1.2 and 1.3 million. Others put it higher still, above 1.3. I refuse to fake precision. I leave that to hallucinating AI and untrustworthy people. But they all do point to the same scale, well over 1 million human beings into this one stretch of coast. And Bahia Strait had its own distinct geography, and that geography matters enormously for the music. Because more than 9 in 10 of the Africans brought to Bahia came from just 2 parts of the continent, the Bight of Benin, the stretch of West African coast the Europeans would call the Slave Coast, around present-day Benin, Togo and southwestern Nigeria, and West Central Africa, the Angola-Congo region. Hold on to those 2, the Bight of Benin and Central Africa. Because the gods, the languages, and the rhythms that came out of those 2 regions are going to shape not only Samba de roda, but candomblé and a great deal of what Bahia hands to the rest of Brazil. This was not a random scatter of people, it was a specific, concentrated inheritance. And that is the workshop. That dense, connected, brutal living region is where a great deal of the raw material got combined into something that had never even existed before. Not preserved, unchanged from Africa, but transformed in Brazil under local Brazilian conditions. And one of the things that came out of that workshop is the circle we started with, Samba de roda, Samba of the circle. We'll come back to it, but first that word, samba, because it already has a history of its own, and most people don't tell it right. A detective question. Where does the word samba actually come from? You will find people who will give you a one-line, entirely confident answer. Be a little suspicious of them, because the honest answer is more interesting and it comes with its own homework attached. The most widely repeated explanation traces samba back to Kimbundu, which is a Bantu language of West Central Africa, spoken in present-day Angola, and specifically to the word samba. And samba is tied to a gesture, the umbigada. The root inside it is umbigo, the navel. The umbigada is that navel-to-navel invitation, a move that turns up across Afro-diasporic circle dances, where one dancer gestures towards another to pull them into the middle and take their place. And I honestly love this detail, because functionally the umbigada is a handshake protocol. It is the little piece of code that runs the circle. It answers the question every group dance has to answer. Whose turn is it now? Without anybody stopping the music to announce it. One body signals the next steps in, the circle keeps turning, the invitation is built right into the dance. However, here is where I have to slow down, because this is exactly the kind of thing that gets compressed into a slogan. There are 3 separate layers here, and they do not all carry the same weight. Layer 1, the language. The link from Samba to Kimbundu Samba is plausible, and it is widely accepted. But word history this far back is argued over by linguists, and the paper trail is very thin. So, plausible and popular, yes, but not proven. Layer 2 is the gesture. The umbigada is real, well documented, and you can watch it in Samba de roda to this day. That part is not in question. And layer 3, what it means. Reading the umbigada as a symbol of invitation, of one person making room for another. That is interpretation, useful and probably right, but a reading, not a fact. And here is the trap I want us both to dodge. Do not let the gesture, which is real, become proof of the word's entire history, which is not settled. The safest conclusion, the one I will actually stand behind, is the following one. Samba carries deep African and especially Bantu inheritance, transformed in Brazil, that is less satisfying than samba comes from this one word, the end. But it is also true. History rarely hands you one clean route for something built by millions of people moving through violence, labor, religion, and celebration. Now here is a question that sounds simple, but it really isn't. If you own almost nothing, no property, no rights, your own time owned by someone else, where do you even find the room to make music, to hold a belief, and to build a community? Well, in the Recôncavo, the answer is that people found the cracks in the system. And 3 of those cracks matter for our story. We will name them separately, and we will keep them separate. Because outsiders too often love to mash them into one exotic blob, which they simply aren't. First come the Catholic Brotherhoods, the Irmandades. Inside a slave society run by a Catholic empire lay brotherhoods organized around saints, which could admit black members, and sometimes black members specifically. And they offered things that were otherwise almost impossible to come by. A proper burial, mutual aid, a feast day, a reason and a right to gather. A brotherhood was cover. It was a legal container blessed by the church, inside which black communities could organize and assemble in the open. Second, there's Afro-Brazilian religion, most famously Candomblé. Candomblé carried West and Central African religious systems, the orixás, the deities, and the practices around them into Brazilian conditions. And it survived by adapting, under heavy oppression or repression. Now, candomblé is a religion. It is not a folklore show. And samba is not a ceremony. These worlds overlapped in the same neighborhoods, and often the same people, the same calendar of feast days. But overlap is not sameness. I'm giving Afro-Brazilian religion its own dedicated episode much later in the series, because it deserves far more than a paragraph. And I do not want to get it wrong in passing, especially since there is much left for me to learn on the topic. And third, the ordinary places. The feast days spilling into the street, the markets, the religious houses, and the quintal, the backyard. The plain domestic yard behind the house is one of the great unsung venues of this whole story. It is where people cooked, where they gathered once the day's work was done, where a circle could form on packed earth with nothing but voices and hands and feet. Now put those three together, the brotherhood that gave you the right to assemble, the religion that carried memory and meaning, and also the yard that gave you a floor, and you can see how a people who legally owned almost nothing built a culture rich enough to outlast the system that oppressed them. That is not a miracle, and I do not want to call it one because calling it a miracle quietly erases the people who did the work. It is closer to engineering under impossible constraints, making the most of the only materials you are actually allowed to touch. Now, here is something that catches people off guard. You would think 1888, abolition, would be the moment black culture in Brazil would finally breathe. Chains off, music free, happy ending. No, we don't live in a utopia, because being legal as a person does not make your culture legal. In the decades around abolition and after it, black music, black religion, and black public gatherings were repeatedly watched, restricted, policed. The clearest documented example would be capoeira, the Afro-Brazilian martial art and dance, which was written into Brazil's penal code as an actual crime in 1890. Please sit with the timing on that. Only 2 years after abolition, the state put a black practice into the law books as illegal. Enforcement swung around a great deal, looser in some places in some decades, but brutal in others. But the pattern holds. Freedom on paper came with surveillance in the street. And the road from there is very slow. It takes most of the 20th century, something we will trace carefully over the next several episodes, for these things to travel from policed, to tolerated, to celebrated, to at last officially honored. For Samba de roda, that honor arrived in our own century. Brazil's National Heritage Institute registered the Samba de roda of the Recôncavo as Cultural Heritage of Brazil in 2004. The following year, UNESCO recognized it internationally, and after centuries of being policed, the circle finally got its certificate. However, we have to be careful here, because recognition is not the same thing as safety. A certificate documents a practice and it dignifies it. It can also freeze it, turn a living, changing thing into a fixed image that outsiders then expect to see performed a particular way. And on its own, the certificate does not pay the masters, train the next generation, or build the instruments, or even keep the local feast days alive. At best, recognition made the responsibility visible, keeping a living practice actually living, in real yards and real towns carried by real people who still know how to do it. That part is not a plaque on a wall, it is work, and it is work that is still going on right now. Finally, let us step back from the machine and look at what we have actually got. We started in a circle on packed earth, and we can now see what holds it up. An ocean crossing nobody chose, a dense, brutal network of plantations and ports and towns. A word that probably reaches back to Angola, a gesture that runs the dance like a line of code, a church-blessed brotherhood, a hidden religion, and a backyard floor, all of it combined over centuries by people the law kept trying to erase into samba. And here is what I do not want you walking away believing, because it is the most common mistake there is. Samba was not invented in one place only, by one person, on one day. It did not arrive from Africa unchanged, and it was not simply cooked up in Bahia and shipped intact down to Rio. Bahia and the Recôncavo are essential. That is where the deep black Atlantic roots and the Samba de roda live. But the story does not finish there. The urban samba we know, the recording studios, the radio, the samba schools, the samba enredo this whole show is named after. Well, that is a Rio story, and it is still coming. Samba became national not because a grateful country simply embraced its black roots, but rather through a long, messy century of migration, selection, business and regulation, and struggle. We are going to earn every step of this story, but before we leave the circle, there is one thing I skipped past on purpose. When that single voice threw out the line and the dancer stepped in, that was already a system, with rules. Samba de roda is not a single beat. It has different internal modes, different ways of organizing the singing and the dancing. One that builds suspense and one that builds momentum. That is not a footnote. It is the musical intelligence inside the circle, and it is the entire subject of our next episode. We're going to stay right here in the roda, lean in close and listen to how it really works. So the next time someone tells you samba is just Brazil's party music, you'll already know the rest of it. It is a circle built by people who were given nothing and who made something that outlived the system that oppressed them, that owned them. That is not decoration, but rather survival, set to a clap and a downbeat. I am Maicão, and this has been Samba Stories. Thank you again for listening. If it gave you something, a like and a comment help these stories find more people. And please do subscribe, because next time we are staying right here in the circle. Até a próxima!